Whether you operate one forklift or thousands, one location or hundreds, the new My Toyota customer portal can help you optimize your operation and material handling equipment. This one-stop, free-to-use platform is designed to help you take control of your information and make smarter decisions, all at the touch of a button. Register and access your data today at my.toyotaforklift.com. That's my.toyotaforklift.com.
The New Warehouse Podcast, hosted by Kevin Lawton, is your source for insights and ideas from the distribution, transportation, and logistics industry. A new episode every Monday morning brings you the latest from industry experts and thought leaders. And now, here's Kevin.
Hey, it's Kevin Lawton with the New Warehouse Podcast, bringing you a new episode today. And on today's episode, I am going to be joined by Steve Hopper. He's the founder and principal over at Inviscid Consulting, and we're going to talk a little bit about Inviscid. We'll find out what he's up to and what he's doing over there, but we're also going to dive into kind of the labor challenges that we see in the warehousing industry today and that have been ongoing for the past couple of years. And we're going to dive into a little bit too around labor performance versus labor productivity. And Steve's going to define that for us, and then we're going to talk a little bit about the differences. So very interested to talk about this and to catch up with Steve here and dive into these topics. So Steve, welcome to the show. How are you?
Thank you. It's good to be here. Doing fine.
Definitely. Happy to get you on. Happy to talk about this topic. I think it's one that's top of mind for a lot of people, one that's been a challenge for quite some time now that we've seen in the industry. But before we dive into that, why don't you kind of give us a little brief overview of Inviscid and also a little bit about your background too?
Sure. Well, Inviscid is a firm that I established 20 years ago this year, a boutique firm specializing in one thing. We help businesses plan and streamline their warehousing, distribution, fulfillment, logistics operations. So driving down costs and improving service levels in those operations is all we do. Personally, I'm an industrial engineer by degree. I've spent my entire career, which is around 38 years in this industry. I had hair when I started this process, but yeah, I've done nothing over that period of time, working with businesses in their operations to do things like increase capacity, reduce operating costs, labor costs, improve service levels like quality and accuracy, those types of things, reduce risk in the operations.
Yeah. And I think that's great. And obviously an industrial engineer, I mean, I can see if you were watching the video, Industrial Engineer Street, right in the back there, you have the sign and everything. So I love that. So definitely a lot of time in the industry and a lot of experience there, I'm sure, especially as a consultant working on different projects for multiple different companies, you get to see a lot of different things. But I'm curious, as we want to dive into this topic around labor, are we right now, from what you're seeing, and, obviously there's been challenges around labor shortage, trying to get people to work, wages going up within the warehousing industry in the past couple of years. And I'm curious, I mean, as we look right now here in early 2024, as we're recording this, I mean, are we still seeing labor challenges in the warehousing industry right now?
Oh, definitely. Ever since I got into this business, fulfillment, warehousing, distribution, it's, you get your hands dirty, you're quote unquote kicking boxes, as we like to say. It's not perceived as being an exciting place to work. And so businesses have always had the challenge of finding qualified labor to work in warehouses and fulfillment centers and so forth. But the events of these last few years have really made that much worse. Obviously, with the pandemic and what we experienced all going through that, just an aging population that a lot of the boomers, so to speak, have kind of worked their way through the workforce and they're retiring in droves. We've also had some kind of an evolution, if you will, of what are the qualifications of the worker. So frankly, finding workers with a certain level of education is one thing. Also, with the language barriers that we experience more and more in the workforce, particularly in supply chain operations. So right now, it's sort of a a culmination of a perfect storm where the businesses are finding it very difficult to find qualified workers to do the, receiving, inventory handling, picking, packing, shipping types of activities in their facilities.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you have a good point there about, it's not necessarily work that everyone wants to do, right? At the end of the day, right? Kicking those boxes around, as you said, and, doing some of those tasks is certainly are challenging and can be labor intensive over time, very manual and repetitive too. And I think people, there's a lot of different options out there now as we look at gig economy and stuff like that, where, you don't have to do things that are necessarily as labor intensive, and they can be a little more attractive. And it's difficult to get some of the newer generation, as you mentioned, kind of the generations aging out there a little bit of the workforce, and, trying to get them kind of enticed and interested. So, I think as we look at that, one of your focuses is kind of around being able to address some of these challenges, but without having to necessarily get more people to address the challenges that maybe you're facing. So talk to us a little bit about that, and how do businesses kind of start to address some of these maybe labor shortages that they have, which might be potential process gaps or something like that. How do they start to address this without actually having to find the workers that maybe they think they need?
Yeah, well, if you think about it, when you have the need for warehousing labor, which is obviously out there, and then you have, it's a supply and demand thing. You've got the need for warehousing labor, that's your demand. And then you have your available workforce, which is the supply, and you're trying to match those two together. So there are a couple of different things businesses can do, to get more work done, in other words. And the obvious, and I think the thing that most people think about, is we can do things like automate, and if you pull up trade magazines and so forth, then many of the cover stories, it's all about, this type of automation or that type of automation. There's certainly nothing wrong with automation, but it's only half the story. Using these tools that automate things and eliminate labor that way, they can be very effective and have been for a number of years. But there's another way that businesses can reduce the need for labor, and that's often overlooked. And that has to do with, how can we take the labor that we have, and frankly, the resources that we have, the level of automation that we have, anything ranging from something really manual at one end to heavily automated at the other end of that spectrum, wherever they are on that, how can we take the workforce that we have and make them more productive? How can we help them to achieve more units per hour, whatever the metric is that is measured? And there are a number of ways to do that, at least in my experience, a lot of businesses frankly neglect. And so there's a significant opportunity to get better results out of the existing workforce without necessarily having to go and hire new people because they're not available, a lot of them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's such a good point, because sometimes you look at it and you're just like, oh, I'm just going to throw bodies at the problem, right? And, sometimes the bodies aren't there to throw in the first place, right? So you want to look at those alternatives to see, like, as you said, how do I get more out of one worker to potentially take and increase my capacity and my overall throughput, to not have to now go find another worker to cover that difference. And I think, some of the things that you point out there are good points as well. But as we start to look at those, how do you kind of suggest that companies start to try and go down that path and navigate that and decide, like, what is the right decision for me here?
The things to look at, there are three primary factors. If you, industrial engineers have a tendency to maybe over compartmentalize in this way, but just to keep it simple, there are three fundamental factors that determine the performance of a worker. And first of all, it's important to understand the difference between productivity and performance. I think most people loosely use the term productivity, and that has a very specific definition in the world of industrial engineering. It's really output divided by input. So units per hour, it would be a great example. And part of that, that's a very raw metric. It's something that's a statistic on a piece of paper that defines productivity. And there's all kinds of different levels of productivity. In warehousing, we see lines per hour, units per hour, cases per hour, not always by hour. It could be units per case, for example. But when we start talking about performance, that's actually a very management, labor-oriented metric, which is an extension of the productivity, and it involves a number of factors. I'll just give you a real basic example. If you and I were both working in a warehouse environment, let's say, Kevin, you and I were both hired on the same day to work in a fulfillment center for Amazon.
Yeah.
And we were both told you need to pick, 200 lines per hour for order picking. Well, if your lines are going to be anvils, like the old kinds of anvils that used to fall on the coyote in the old cartoons, and my lines were going to be, pens, but we're both supposed to do 250 lines an hour, is that a fair way to measure our relative performance on the job?
Right.
Well, really it's not, because the attributes of the anvil are different from the attributes of the pen. So in looking at performance, you're looking at the attributes of the work to determine as a percentage, where 100% would represent what is a trained worker working at a reasonable pace over a sustainable period of time, like an 8-hour shift. What is a realistic volume that worker should be able to do of those types of products, whatever the products are, like the pen or the anvil, versus just a sheer units per hour kind of a metric. So performance really factors in many more things. And I mentioned earlier that when you sort of look at it loosely, performance is driven by three fundamental concepts. One is the obvious that everybody talks about, is pace. How fast are you going? And that's the thing I think everybody tends to maybe obsess on too much. It's like, how quick are you working? Because there's two other factors that can be as important and perhaps more important. One is the method that's being used. Am I using the right tool? Am I following the right steps in the process to perform the work? And then secondly, it's the utilization. Am I using my time wisely? So for example, if I'm supposed to be on the clock for an hour and I've spent half an hour, playing with my phone and texting my friend, and I've talked to this guy over here about the Super Bowl, and I'm, doodling on my paper or whatever it might be, obviously I'm not engaged in my work and my utilization is going down. So those three factors, they compound each other. So an example would be and I use this a lot with my clients, we think about Michael Jordan, who arguably was the greatest basketball player of all time. Yeah. He had a pace. He would run up and down the court between offense and defense. He had a method. He was known as Air Jordan. He clearly had a method of shooting that made him great. And he also was used throughout the game. I mean, his coaches, kept him in the game for most of the game as much as possible. And so think about that. If Michael Jordan had only been in the game 30 minutes a game instead of almost 60, that would have affected his performance. If he had been floor Jordan instead of Air Jordan and only shot with his feet on the floor, that would have affected his performance. And then lastly, if he had just kind of trotted, walked very slowly down the court from offense to defense, all game long, that would have affected his performance. But when you put those three things together, it would have dramatically affected his performance. So when we're looking at the workforce and trying to find ways to make the workforce have higher performance, which ultimately would result in higher productivity, we have to look at those three factors and say, how can we improve them? And so long answer to your short question is, you look at those three factors and there are ways that you can take a workforce and make improvements to those three factors that will ultimately result in greater performance out of an existing workforce. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's so great to hear you break it down in those three ways, because I think, like you said, I mean, oftentimes it is such a focus on the pace, right? I mean, like you got the manager coming by and the employees, like you're not moving fast enough, right? You're not moving fast enough, right? But there's all those other factors, like you said, the method, like have they been trained on the proper method? Have you shared best practices amongst your pickers, for example, or something like that to be able to do that? And are you utilizing the right people in the right place when you need to? And I think that's such a great way to look at it from that perspective. And I mean, it's very interesting. I mean, I want to ask you, I mean, and when you look at that, right, and you say, you know, if somebody comes to you and they're like, oh, like we have this problem where short staffed, we have, 20 pickers, and really if we look at it, like we think we actually need maybe like 30 to be able to keep up. I mean, what do you think is, or maybe what do you see is kind of sometimes the most common issue there that's kind of something that's easy to address for the operation, or something that's kind of consistently overlooked by a lot of different operations?
Yeah, well, there's been quite a few things actually, but sure. It's just interesting, just as an observation, as someone who does what I do in the industry and worked with a couple of hundred clients over all these years. It's just interesting that so many businesses, even going way up to these multi-billion-dollar businesses, I mean, an $80 billion company that I've worked with comes to mind. They're not doing the basic blocking and tackling of managing the workforce. And when I mean that, I mean actively being engaged with the workforce and coaching them and training them and measuring their performance, measuring the statistics that matter against the workforce, and trying to make those numbers improve. They're sort of, hiring a bunch of people, throwing them out in the warehouse and hoping that they get the best out of them. And right. First of all, that's expensive. Secondly, your likelihood of workforce turnover goes way up when you do that because of this lack of satisfaction of the workers. And then, ultimately your productivity really suffers from that. So vast majority of businesses I work with, if they're not doing those things, they're not really actively managing the workforce and measuring the workforce, there is usually significant opportunity to improve the productivity of the workforce, regardless of how automated the facility is. And so that's the thing, is really understanding what you have as a workforce and knowing what you can do to get the best performance out of that workforce.
Interesting. And I'm curious there too. I mean, you mentioned that, no matter how automated the facility is, right, you still need to be able to manage and measure that workforce to get the most out of them. But I'm curious, I mean, from your perspective, do you see sometimes where a company maybe goes to automation thinking that's the solution, and maybe they actually were not ready for it, or they could have potentially done something less costly to make a difference first before trying to lean on automation as a solution?
We'll be back after a quick break.
You hear a lot about supply chains these days, because if the past couple years have taught us anything, it's that an efficient, well-managed supply chain is absolutely critical to keeping businesses successful and consumers happy. I'm Will Haywood, and I host a podcast called All Business, No Boundaries, where we talk about supply chains, how they work, what happens when they don't, and the innovations that are redefining what's possible in the world of logistics. Join me for insightful interviews with thought leaders and industry experts. We discuss how optimizing supply chains can break down the barriers that are holding businesses back. That's All Business, No Boundaries by DHL Supply Chain. Listen and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.
Yeah, that is a great question. Yes, absolutely. Before, we often do assessments, operational assessments. And the analogy there, it's sort of like when you go to the doctor once a year. Hopefully you go once a year and get a physical. What happens? I mean, you go in to see the doctor asks you a bunch of questions about your lifestyle and your things that you're experiencing and any pain and all this kind of stuff. And by sort of visiting with you, and they may take some tests, they may look at your cholesterol or your, blood pressure or, all these things. And as a result of that, the doctor sort of makes an assessment of your overall health, and usually we'll make some recommendations. In my case, they'll say, Steve, you need to lose some weight, and you need to get more exercise. That's the kinds of things the doctor tends to tell me. But an assessment is very similar to that. It's sort of like a warehouse doctor going and looking at the operation. And so we do probably a dozen of those a year at this point. And through that process, before we even go on site, we send out, it's called a pre-visit request for information. It's to allow us to do our homework before we go on site. The assessment on site lasts from anywhere from 1 day to several days. We've done them as long as 3 or 4 months long, detailed, down and dirty multi-site assessments. But typical assessment is usually a couple of days at one site. And before we go on site, we send this series of questions and gathering, preliminary information. One of the first questions on that is, what are your top 3 goals for your operation to support your business? Interestingly, many times the answer that we get back, one of the answers of those top 3 we get back is automate. The client will say, we want to automate. So that's when I have to sort of play devil's advocate and say, is your goal really to automate, or is your goal really to get the benefits that automation would provide, such as reduced operating costs? That's a goal, to reduce operating costs. The goal isn't necessarily to automate. Now, automation can be a means to achieve the goal, like I mentioned earlier, but it's not the goal itself. And so, part of what we're doing is we're making people think, okay, if you already have this facility, you already have the equipment, material handling equipment and systems and conveyors and rack and whatever else you've got, and maybe you're not automated yet, but you have these resources. Wouldn't you want to get the best you can out of the resources you already have before you start investing all these capital expenses into the next level of automation? And there's risk that goes along with that. Implementing systems can sometimes have issues, as we've seen in industry. So it's not to say that there's anything wrong with those kinds of improvements, but to start with, the low-hanging fruit, you get the best out of the resources you've already got at your fingertips. And so getting them to think about that as opposed to automation itself as the goal can really pay big dividends.
Yeah. And I think that's such a great thing to call out there, is that, just saying that your goal is to put automation in place is not, it's not necessarily a goal, right? I mean, it's almost like you're saying, like, everybody's doing automation, so I think I need automation, or maybe I just want to say that we're doing automation, right? Or something like that. But I mean, I think it's great to that point where, like, hey, you could achieve some of the same goals that maybe you're trying to do with automation without necessarily getting to automation yet. And I think a lot of times too, if we see where, examples, like you said, if you're not, managing your workforce and measuring your workforce, but you have all this automation in place, well, you're never going to truly optimize, really, right? And you're never going to really necessarily get the full benefit of the automation if you don't have kind of those foundational things in place to be able to do that. So I think it's really interesting that you call that out there. And I think it's great to hear that perspective too, to be able to say, like, hey, there's other things we can do besides getting and just jumping right onto the automation boat, right? And making sure, like, oh man, we got labor challenges, like throw some robots at it, right? Something like that. Yeah. What are you gonna say?
Yeah, I want to be very clear. I'm not adverse to automation. I think automation is great. I've been involved in a number of major projects over the years with automation. In fact, back in the olden days, I used to sell automation. So I'm a big believer in automation, but it's a tool. It's not a goal. And sometimes when you implement better practices and better ways of managing the workforce and all those things, and you automate, you get sort of a 1 + 1 = 3 scenario where they both work together to create an even better result. But just to, naively jump into automation and think that automation is the answer, I think that's somewhat foolish.
Yeah, absolutely. And definitely, me too. I'll say I'm not, downplaying automation or anything like that as well. But I think it's great to have that understanding too, that like it's not it's not necessarily the immediate answer you always need, and it's able to, you know, improve on processes and different things as well to get some more immediate results and some maybe less expensive results too, we could say too at some point. So very interesting here to talk to you, Steve, about this stuff. And I'm curious, I mean, as we look into the future, I mean, where do you kind of see the issues around, you know, labor shortages, labor performance? I mean, where do you see that kind of heading into the future? I mean, do you think we're getting to a point where it's not going to be a challenge anymore, or is it just going to be an increasing, ongoing challenge? What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, well, I mean, looking ahead, unless businesses start doing some of the things that we talked about, it's only going to get worse. I mean, I think that I'm not one to say the sky is falling, you know, but I think the mindsets that management teams have about their workforce and about, you know, all the factors, how you hire your workforce, how you train your workforce, how you manage your workforce on a day-to-day basis, how you measure your workforce. And that's really important because so many are not even bothering to measure the proper way. And until they do that, this problem isn't going to get better, because the trends that I mentioned at the top of our discussion are getting worse, if you think of it that way. I mean, we're getting the pool of workers that we have to work with is just, you know, relatively speaking, getting smaller relative to the amount of work that needs to get done. So that trend, I don't see getting any better anytime soon. It just reinforces the need for businesses to kind of change their mindset and try to find ways to get the best they can out of the workforce they have. And frankly, do a better job of bringing workers in. You know, I mentioned earlier about it not being a sexy world to work in, but there are things that businesses can do to encourage workers to want to work in their operation in the first place. And, you know, one of the things that's talked about, particularly with younger generations, you know, Gen Y type workers, is things like gamification, you know, finding ways to make jobs be more like a video game, for lack of a better way to put that.
Yeah.
But, you know, there are things that you can do, particularly in a typical warehousing environment, typical fulfillment environment, that can make jobs seem more like a game and less like drudgery. And so doing things like that and giving workers flexibility in terms of, you know, hours, days of the week, you know, the modern distribution operation, trying to get the workers in. It doesn't always have to be a very structured, you have to work 5 days a week between, you know, this time in the morning and that time in the afternoon or whatever it is. You know, management can do a better job of accommodating the schedules that workers want to work and letting them work during those times. You know, there's just so many different things. I could go on and on with this, but there's so many different things that businesses can do to A, find and hire workers, B, retain those workers so that they don't turn over and you keep them on the workforce, and then C, continuing to improve the results that you get out of those workers. And unless they really start doing that, it's just going to get harder and harder. In fact, I had a discussion with a gentleman who he managed a very large retail distribution center. And he told me, he said, I would hire 200 people tomorrow. Yeah. Tomorrow, I would hire 200 people if I could just find 200 people who could do two things: read and follow instructions.
Yeah.
And no, I'm sorry, he said three things: read, follow instructions, and show up for work.
Yeah.
Just not even coming in when they're supposed to come in, because there's no incentive to do that.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's such great points there, and how you are able to make that workplace like a better environment, more enjoyable too, as well, to come to work as much as you can enjoy coming to work and picking orders or something like that. But, you know, those types of things really help to increase the retention too, which I think is another, you know, part of the problem. Is like you just said, you know, if you can find 200 people that really show up to work, like, you would hire them, right? But that's one of the things is, you know, you get people in the door, and then how do you also keep them in the door too, which is a very important thing to emphasize too. So,
yeah. And I want to mention on that topic, one thing I don't recommend is paying people just to show up. I've seen in a couple of client operations where, you know, people get an incentive. Hey, if you only miss 3 days of the month, you get a bonus. I mean, that's not a good way to manage the workforce. It should be based on performance, not based on showing up. And secondly, the idea that raising wages is always the right answer. If you're looking for people to hire in a distribution center, for example, you need to understand what they want. And a lot of surveys have gone out saying that to some degree, the prevailing workforce isn't necessarily looking for higher wages. They're looking for some of these other things, these intangibles like flexible time. Now, if you're paying $10 an hour and the workforce, the warehouse across the street paying $18 an hour for warehouse workers, well, then you need to raise your wages.
Yeah, that's tough. Yeah.
But I mean, just knee-jerk reaction saying, we'll just keep increasing the wages until we get workers. Well, maybe there's other things you could do to pull in those workers rather than just drive up the hourly wage rate.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a good point too. I mean, and certainly, in some of the more densely warehouse populated areas in the country, you see that all over the place. And it's just, it's tough sometimes as a warehouse manager. You're driving to work, you're trying to get people in the door and you see whatever, warehouse next door just threw up a sign and they're paying like $2 or $3 more than you are. And you're like, oh my gosh, I hope my employees don't drive down that road. Right. So, I mean, it's very important to do that. And it's great to hear all these insights from you, Steve, on these challenges that people are facing and how to maybe address them in a different way than people may first think of and look at that performance overall of the employees and how to help increase that for them. So very interesting insights from you. I appreciate you coming on the show today here. If people are interested to get in touch with you or want to learn more about Inviscid Consulting, what's the best way to do that?
Well, if they want to connect with me personally, they can find me on LinkedIn and go to our website. They can certainly post something through the website. And the website is just inviscidconsulting.com. I think you may show the link here. But yeah, those would probably be the easiest way to reach out to me.
All right, great. And we'll definitely put all that information in the show notes as well as the newwarehouse.com so people can easily find it. So, Steve, thank you once again for coming on the show today and sharing your insights.
You've been listening to the New Warehouse Podcast with Kevin Lawton. Subscribe and check us out online at thenewwarehouse.com.
Thank you for listening to this episode. If you want more content from the New Warehouse, check out our new video series called All Hands on LinkedIn. Just search for the New Warehouse on LinkedIn and follow along.